My husband wasn't even buried yet, and already my daughter-in-law was smiling like she had won a prize. That's the first thought that cut through me as I sat in the front pew of St. Helena's Cathedral in Savannah. The heavy scent of lilies hung in the air, clinging to black clothes and damp hair, while candlelight flickered against the stained glass windows. Every whisper, every shuffle of a shoe on the old stone floor echoed like a judgment. I kept my eyes on the polished oak casket at the front, where my husband Charles Whitmore lay. His photograph rested on an easel beside it, capturing him in a younger, more hopeful time, his broad smile, his bright blue eyes. I wanted to remember him that way, before sickness dimmed his strength, before greed began circling around him like vultures. But then I felt the heat of a gaze, sharp and deliberate. I turned my head slightly, and there she was, Sabrina Whitmore, my daughter-in-law, dressed in a fitted black dress that looked more like something for cocktails than for grief, her lips curved upward. Not in sorrow, not in sympathy, but in triumph. She leaned close, her perfume sharp as ice. "It's all mine now," she whispered. The words sliced through the hush of the church. A private dagger meant only for me. I froze. For a second, I thought maybe I had imagined it. Maybe my grief was twisting her smirk into something uglier. But then, like salt rubbed into a fresh wound, I heard the voice of my granddaughter, her daughter, repeat it, soft and innocent, not even knowing the cruelty she carried on her tongue. "Grandma, you're not really family anymore." The words came from Chloe, only 10 years old, sitting beside her mother. She didn't understand the full weight of what she said. She was just repeating what she had heard at home. But it didn't matter. My heart cracked all the same. I turned my eyes back toward the casket. My hand trembled slightly where it rested on my lap, clutching the embroidered handkerchief I had stitched decades ago, initials still etched into its corner. I tried to hold steady, to breathe, but the sting was sharp. Around me, I felt the shift of the room. The guests had heard, neighbors, business associates, old friends of Charles who hadn't visited in years but were eager to attend his funeral. Their eyes darted toward me and then away again, some full of pity, others with thinly veiled curiosity. A few whispered into gloved hands, heads bent together, like carrion birds circling a body, but none of them spoke. None of them stood. They let the venom slide through the silence like it was none of their business. And maybe, to them, it wasn't. I sat straighter, locking my jaw. I would not give Sabrina the satisfaction of seeing me break. The pastor began to speak at the altar, his voice low, steady, full of the usual promises about eternal rest and heavenly comfort. But his words barely reached me. They were muffled by the pounding of my heart, by the echo of that cruel whisper repeating in my head. "It's all mine now. You're not really family anymore." This was how Sabrina saw me. Not as the woman who had built everything alongside Charles. Not as a mother or grandmother or partner in a life's work, but as an obstacle to be erased. I stared at the casket. Charles and I had built our company, our fortune, our home, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. And yet, in this very church, in front of the whole city, I was being written out of my own life story. Sabrina smiled politely as mourners passed by our pew to offer their condolences. She played her part well, murmuring about how hard the loss was, how strong the family would remain. But every time she glanced at me, the mask slipped just enough to reveal the sneer underneath. It wasn't grief that lived in her eyes that day. It was conquest. I thought of Chloe's little voice again, repeating words too sharp for a child. "Grandma, you're not really family anymore." That cut deeper than anything Sabrina could have said, because it meant the poison had already spread. My son Matthew had chosen this woman, and now their daughter, my granddaughter, was being taught that I was disposable. The thought made me sick. I could almost hear the whispers of history rewriting itself already. Charles was the great builder, Charles was the visionary, and Eleanor? She was just the wife who smiled from the sidelines. I clenched my handkerchief so tightly that the lace nearly tore. The funeral pressed on. Prayers rose and fell. Hymns echoed off the high ceilings. Guests dabbed their eyes, though many of them had never bothered to call when Charles was alive. But I stayed rigid, staring ahead, refusing to weep. Not because I didn't love him. Not because the loss wasn't real, but because I understood something. sitting in that pew with venom dripping into my ears. This wasn't just a funeral. This was a battlefield, and I would not fall on it. The pastor invited people forward to share memories. A few stood, old colleagues, golf partners, business associates. They spoke of Charles as if he had been a titan who built everything with his bare hands, as if his story had been one of singular genius and endless charm. Not. One of them mentioned the nights I stayed up balancing ledgers by candlelight. Not one spoke of the years I sacrificed my own career to keep the business alive. Not one recalled how I sold my mother's sapphire locket just to make payroll. It was as if I had never existed. I felt Sabrina's eyes on me, daring me to stand, daring me to interrupt the polished eulogies with truths. Too raw for polite company, but I stayed. Silent, because I understood something she did not. Some truths are not for public speeches. Some truths are weapons, and weapons are meant to be drawn at the right moment, so I sat there still and composed and let her think she had already won. A hand brushed my shoulder. It was the pastor, murmuring something about strength, about endurance. I nodded without hearing, my gaze never leaving the casket. Behind me, whispers rose again. Pity, curiosity, judgment. I could feel Sabrina smiling at them, spinning her silent narrative. Eleanor is finished. Eleanor has nothing left. Eleanor will fade away. But inside me, something else stirred. Not grief, not fear, not despair. Something colder. Resolve. I leaned slightly forward, whispering in my own heart, so low only I could hear it. They think this is my ending, but this is only my beginning. And as I looked once more at Charles's casket, I made a vow. They had rewritten my place in this family for the last time. They had underestimated me for the last time. They had mistaken my silence for weakness for the very last time. The church bell tolled. The service drew to its close. Guests began to shift, gathering coats, lowering voices into murmurs of farewell. Sabrina adjusted her dress and rose gracefully, her hand tightening around Chloe's as if she were leading a victory march out of the cathedral. But I didn't move. Not yet. I sat still, watching the crowd drift toward the doors, my eyes lingering on the marble steps outside, where the sunlight cut sharp against the shadows, because I knew something no one else in that church knew. The story wasn't over, not for Charles, not for me, not for any of them. And when the will was read, when the truth came to light, this family would finally understand the weight of the woman they had tried to erase. I rose at last, smoothing my black skirt with a steady hand. My voice was calm, almost soft, as I whispered to myself one final line before stepping into the world outside. They think they buried me today. They don't realize I was the one holding the shovel. Before they erased me, before they rewrote my life, I was someone. That's the thought that ran through me as I sat in my quiet room after the funeral. The air still smelled faintly of lilies and damp stone, but my mind had already wandered back to who I was before Charles's legacy became a battlefield. Most people at that funeral thought of me as a shadow, a widow, frail, dependent past her prime. But they didn't know where I started. They didn't know what I gave. I was once Miss Eleanor Price, a literature teacher at Savannah High School. My classroom smelled of chalk dust and old paper. My desk was always stacked high with essays to grade. My evenings filled with lesson plans, the lives of students I believed in. I loved stories. I loved the way a poem could make even the hardest boy pause, or how a shy girl could find her voice in an essay about hope. I believed in words the way some people believe in prayer. I had dreams. Graduate school, maybe even a doctorate one day. A quiet life of books, of knowledge, of guiding young minds. And then I met Charles Whitmore. He wasn't a scholar, not by any measure. He was ambition in a pressed shirt, charm in polished shoes. He came into my life like a storm one afternoon, delivering supplies to the school where I worked. He was full of plans even then, talking about how he'd build a business that would outgrow Savannah, how one day his name would be known on the docks, on contracts, across the ocean. He didn't just talk, he believed. And I believed in him. We married a year later. Not because I thought he would be rich, but because I believed in his fire. And when he asked me to leave teaching and help him with the fledgling timber and shipping company he was scraping together, I didn't hesitate. I walked away from the classroom, from the chalkboard, from my dreams of advanced degrees. And I walked into his world of invoices, contracts, and docs that smelled of salt and sweat. Our first office wasn't much. A converted storage room above a sawmill, one desk, 2 chairs, a heater that rattled like it was on its last breath. But it was ours. I became whatever the business needed me to be: secretary, bookkeeper, proofreader, negotiator. On nights when Charles collapsed from exhaustion, I sat at that desk balancing ledgers until dawn. I typed contracts on a secondhand typewriter until my fingers cramped. I filed legal documents, called suppliers, argued for better terms. And when money ran out, because it always did in those early years, I sacrificed. I remember one night, staring at a payroll deadline we couldn't meet. Our workers had families. They depended on those checks. The bank wouldn't extend credit. The accounts were empty, so I went to my dresser and opened a small velvet box. Inside was my mother's sapphire locket, the only thing of real value she had left me before she died. I took it to a pawn shop under the neon hum of a failing sign, and I sold it. That locket had been in my family for 3 generations. It was supposed to pass to my daughter, to my granddaughter, but instead, it paid for payroll that month. When I brought Charles the receipts, he stared at me in silence, then pulled me into his arms. "We built this together," he whispered. "Don't you ever let anyone say different." And for years, he lived by that. In meetings, he introduced me as his partner. At family gatherings, he spoke of my sacrifices. His respect was public, unwavering. We built that company from nothing. From sawdust and sweat, from sleepless nights and empty pockets, we survived every storm. But success has a way of changing how people see you. When the company began to thrive, when contracts poured in and the Whitmore name became known in Savannah, the story shifted. People began to look at Charles as the mastermind, the self-made man. And me? I became the wife who smiled politely at dinners. At first, I corrected them. I reminded people of the early years, of the locket, of the nights at the ledger. But over time, I grew tired of telling the truth to people who preferred the easier lie. Even Charles's own family sometimes forgot. His sisters would laugh about how lucky I was to have married well, as if luck had been the reason I pawned my mother's jewelry. Charles still knew the truth. He never stopped reminding me that it was ours, not his alone. But others, their memories were shorter. And Sabrina? She took advantage of that. She wasn't there in the early years. She didn't see the sacrifices. To her, I was just a woman who cooked, who hosted dinners, who lived in the house Charles built. She called him self-made, like I was furniture in the background. That was the first cut. A small one, but sharp. And then she began to twist the story further. She whispered that years ago, when Charles's mother was in the hospital, I had purposely delayed paying the bills. That I had used her suffering as leverage to force the family to sell their land. The truth? I had pawned my locket to pay those very bills. But truth doesn't spread as fast as lies. And by the time I heard the rumor, it had already taken root. I remember sitting at a dinner table once hearing my own son, Matthew, repeat Sabrina's lie casually, like it was fact. "Dad built everything," he said. "Mom just hosted dinners." I set my fork down that night. I didn't argue. What good would it have done? The lie had won. And in that moment, I realized how fragile memory is. How easily history can be rewritten if no one fights for the truth. But I wasn't ready to fight then. Not yet. Back then, I still thought silence would protect me. When I think of those years now, I don't just remember the sacrifices. I remember the warmth, too. There were nights when Charles and I celebrated tiny victories over cheap wine at our rickety desk. Days when we signed contracts that kept the company afloat. Evenings when we sat on the porch, exhausted, laughing about how we fooled everyone into thinking we knew what we were doing. For a long time, the sacrifices felt worth it. Because we were together. Because he respected me. Because he knew the truth. But the cruelest part of life is this. Once the person who knows your truth is gone, others are free to bury it. And at Charles's funeral, as I sat there listening to lies whispered louder than prayers, I realized my story had already been stolen. But they didn't know me as well as they thought. Because if there's one thing I had learned in those early years, it was patience. I had waited through hunger, through exhaustion, through storms and sleepless nights. I could wait again. I could hold my silence until the right moment. And when I finally chose to speak, The truth would not just defend me, it would destroy them. Lies spread faster than truth, and sometimes they become more powerful than memory. That's what I learned in the months after Charles's health began to decline. It started small. A whisper at the edge of a conversation, a sideways glance at family dinners, a tone that shifted when I entered the room, and at the center of it all was Sabrina. She had a talent, I'll give her that. A way of slipping poison into a sentence so casually, so gently, that people swallowed it before they realized they'd been fed. The lie was simple, but devastating. She told people that years ago, when Charles's mother was hospitalized, I had delayed paying the bills on purpose. That I had used her illness as leverage to pressure the family into selling a valuable piece of land. The truth was the opposite. I had pawned my sapphire locket, my last connection to my mother, to pay those bills when insurance stalled. But lies are easier to believe when they make a villain of the person you've already decided to push aside. And I was the perfect villain for Sabrina's story. I remember the first time I realized the rumor had taken root. We were sitting around the dining table one evening. Charles, still alive then but frail, pushed his food around the plate. Matthew, our son, was cutting into his steak when he said it. So casual. So certain. Dad built everything. Mom just hosted dinners. She even delayed Grandma's hospital bills back then. I froze. The fork slipped from my hand and clattered against the plate. My eyes darted to Charles, but he didn't speak. He was too tired, too weak. I looked at my son, my boy. The child I had raised, the boy I had sacrificed for, the man I thought would one day honor the truth. And there it was, spilling from his lips like it was fact. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand and shout the truth until the walls shook. I wanted to remind him of the nights he slept warm in his bed because I was at the desk, calculating numbers that kept the lights on. But instead, I sat there, silent, because I realized something in that moment. He didn't want the truth. He had already chosen the lie. From then on, the distance grew. Invitations to family gatherings grew fewer. Holidays felt colder. Conversations around me became thinner, clipped. Sabrina was careful about it. She never confronted me outright. Instead, she made sure I was always adjacent, present, but peripheral. When neighbors came by, she'd tell stories about Charles's genius, how he had built the Whitmore business from nothing. If I tried to add something, she would smile sweetly and say, "Eleanor loves telling those old stories." And then the conversation would shift, leaving me stranded like a child ignored by adults. At first, I tried to defend myself quietly. I mentioned the locket, the sacrifices, the truth. But the more I spoke, the less anyone seemed to listen. Their eyes glazed, their polite smiles tightened. No one wanted my truth. They wanted Sabrina's version. And slowly I felt myself fading in their eyes. Not the woman who built a company. Not the wife who sacrificed everything. Not the mother who carried their family through storms. Just a burden. There's a kind of cruelty in silence, when people stop meeting your eyes. When conversations end the moment you enter the room. When you're present, but never acknowledged. It's not always words that cut deepest. Sometimes it's the lack of them. I remember one Christmas. The house was full of people, laughter, children running down the halls. I stood in the kitchen carving ham, waiting for someone, anyone, to ask me to sit at the table. But no one did. I placed the platter in the center, wiped my hands on my apron, and stood back. Sabrina leaned in close to Matthew, whispering something that made him chuckle. Chloe sat on her lap, dressed in red velvet, smiling as she repeated whatever little phrase her mother had taught her. I was invisible in a room I had once ruled. That night, I cried alone in my bedroom. Not because of the whispers, not because of the lie, but because of the silence. Because I realized the people I loved most were letting me disappear. I thought of Charles often during those days. How proud he had once been of me. How he had said, "We built this together." But even he, near the end, was too tired to correct the story when others told it differently. Sometimes he would just sit in his chair, listening to Sabrina brag about Matthew's vision for the future, about Chloe's bright destiny, about the Whitmore legacy being in good hands. He'd glance at me, as if he wanted to speak, but then he'd close his eyes. Too weary to fight. I don't blame him. But I felt the loss. When the man who knows your truth no longer has the strength to say it aloud, the world rushes in to bury it. One evening, I overheard Sabrina in the hallway, speaking to one of her friends on the phone. Oh, Eleanor? She was just a teacher. She never did anything for the company. Charles built it all. She just spent money and played hostess. Honestly, she should be grateful we keep her around. Her voice was sugar sweet, but the poison dripped with every syllable. I stood behind the cracked door, my breath caught in my throat, listening to her reduce my life to a shadow, grateful, as if my entire existence had been a debt owed to them. I went to bed that night staring at the ceiling, my fists clenched under the blanket. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was theft. They weren't just pushing me aside. They were stealing my story, rewriting it so that when I was gone, no one would remember what I had truly done. And I realized something in those dark hours, staring at the ceiling fan spin in lazy circles above me. Silence was no longer protecting me. It was burying me. But even then, I didn't act, not yet, because I had learned one lesson in those early years with Charles. One truth he had repeated over and over as we struggled to keep the business alive. Never show your whole hand until the time is right. So I let Sabrina think she had won. I let Matthew believe the lie. I let Chloe repeat her mother's words, not knowing the full weight of them. I let the world see me as a burden, because I knew the truth, and I knew the day would come when that truth would no longer whisper. It would roar. They didn't throw me out of the family. They made me their servant instead. After Charles's death, after the funeral's venom and the whispers that followed, Matthew and Sabrina suggested, so sweetly, so politely, that I move into their riverfront estate in Savannah. They told the world it was to keep me close, that I would never be alone. The neighbors praised their generosity. People at church murmured about how kind they were to care for me. But I knew the truth. They didn't want me cared for. They wanted me contained. The estate was grand, with tall white columns, sprawling verandas, and wide windows that looked out over the river. At sunset, the water glowed gold, and the oaks dripped with Spanish moss. Beautiful and heavy like veils of mourning, but inside those walls, I was not a guest, I was a worker. At first, it happened subtly. Would you mind watching Chloe for a while? I've got errands, Sabrina would say. Mom, could you handle the laundry? Sabrina's swamped, Matthew would add, his eyes glued to his phone. One chore at a time. Small things. Harmless requests, but soon it became routine. I was the one cooking dinners while Sabrina hosted business socials on the veranda. I was the one folding Matthew's shirts, scrubbing pots, sweeping floors. I was the one staying up late to check Chloe's homework, reading her bedtime stories while her parents clinked wine glasses with guests downstairs. And no one thanked me. Not once. It wasn't framed as help. It was expected. I became invisible in that house. The worst part wasn't the work. I had worked harder in my life. I had scrubbed offices, typed until my fingers bled. Sacrificed sleep for survival. The worst part was the erasure. When I stood at the stove, stirring stew, I heard Sabrina's voice drifting from the veranda. Oh, Charles built everything. He was the visionary. Matthew's just like him. He inherited that brilliance. And then with a sweet laugh, Eleanor? Oh, she was just a teacher. She never understood business. That's why Charles carried it all himself. Lies. Smooth, polished lies. But I stood there quietly with the wooden spoon in my hand, the scent of onions and garlic rising, as if I were the hired cook. And that was exactly how they wanted me seen. One night, they held a grand party. The kind where the driveway was lined with luxury cars and the air smelled of cigars and perfume. The Whitmore estate glowed with lanterns and laughter, glasses clinking under the stars. I had spent the entire day preparing food, arranging flowers, setting tables. Not once did Sabrina lift a hand to help. At the height of the evening, as guests gathered in the great room, I carried in a silver tray of hors d'oeuvres. A wealthy investor I didn't recognize looked at me and smiled. Ah, the housekeeper, he said warmly. You keep this place running beautifully. The room laughed politely. My face flushed. My chest tightened, but before I could respond, Sabrina's laughter cut through the air. She didn't correct him. She didn't say, "That's my mother-in-law." She just smiled, a glass of champagne in her hand, and let the humiliation hang in the room like smoke. I excused myself quietly and carried the tray back to the kitchen, where the walls didn't laugh. That night, I lay awake in my narrow guest room upstairs, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly. The laughter from the party still echoed faintly through the floorboards. I felt smaller than I had in years. Invisible. Erased. A few days later, I sat on the porch swing with Chloe, helping her with a school project about family history. She asked me questions in her small, innocent voice. "Grandma, what did you do when you were younger?" My heart lifted. Finally, a chance to tell the truth. I began softly, telling her about my years as a teacher, about the sacrifices I made to help her grandfather build the company. I even told her about the sapphire locket I sold, about how much it had meant to me. Chloe listened wide-eyed, pencil still in her hand, but before I could finish, Sabrina appeared in the doorway. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed, a smile too sharp to be kind. "Chloe, don't bother Grandma with more of her boring history lessons," she said. Her words fell like a slap. Chloe's eyes dropped to her notebook. The moment was gone. And just like that, another piece of my story was stolen. Every day in that house chipped away at me. Not because of the work. I could scrub floors, wash dishes, fold clothes. Those things didn't break me. What broke me was being treated as if my past didn't exist, as if my sacrifices had never happened, as if my entire life was nothing more than dust they could sweep away with a word. I was alive, breathing, standing in the same house, and yet to them, I was already gone, a ghost who cleaned, a shadow who cooked, a voice no one wanted to hear. But ghosts watch, ghosts listen, and ghosts wait. I may have been invisible in their eyes, but I wasn't blind. I saw the cracks in their smiles. I heard the whispers of their plans. I noticed the tension when Matthew and Sabrina thought no one else was watching. And every moment of humiliation, every cruel dismissal, every laugh at my expense, I tucked it away, because I knew something they had forgotten. I knew that I still had a place in this story. And when the time came, I would not just remind them, I would make them regret ever trying to erase me. There are two kinds of deaths. The one that buries your body, and the one that buries your name. Charles's death had been the first. What Sabrina and Matthew were doing to me now, that was the second. And some days, I wondered which one hurt more. I sat alone in my narrow guest room one evening, staring at the small mirror above the dresser. The woman who looked back at me didn't feel like me anymore. Her hair was thinner, her face lined, her eyes tired. The kind of woman people looked through instead of at, I whispered to the mirror just to hear my own voice. "Who are you now?" The silence that followed was louder than any answer. The day-to-day routine in their riverfront estate blurred together. Cooking, cleaning, folding, caring for Chloe. No one said thank you. No one asked how I was. I was useful, but not valued. Present, but not wanted. Invisible. And every time I tried to share a memory of Charles, or a story of our sacrifices, Sabrina shut it down with a sharp smile. Not another boring tale from the old days. The words hit harder than I let show. Because if no one remembers your past, then what were all the sacrifices for? What good was selling my sapphire locket, those sleepless nights at the ledger, those decades of labor, if my own family erased it with a sentence? One evening, I overheard Matthew talking in the den. His voice was hushed, but the walls carried sound. "Mom's not really herself anymore," he said. "She just drifts. Sabrina's right. She's a burden." I froze in the hallway, the tray of folded laundry heavy in my hands. A burden, from my own son's lips. I gripped the banister until my knuckles went white. My chest ached, but no tears came. Not anymore. I had cried too much already. That was the moment I understood the full truth. They had erased me. I was no longer Eleanor Whitmore, partner, builder, wife, mother. I was just an inconvenience they tolerated. That realization could have broken me, but instead it lit something else. Late that night, lying in bed, I thought of Charles. His voice came back to me, clear as if he were standing by my side. "Never show your full hand until you must." He had said it countless times during the early days of the company. When creditors circled, when competitors lied, when storms nearly drowned our ships, we never revealed everything. We always held something back. A contract, a reserve, a plan no one knew about. That was how we survived, and that was how I would survive now. Because the truth was, I hadn't shown my full hand. Not to Sabrina. Not to Matthew. Not to anyone. I thought about the safe tucked away in my guest room closet. Few people even knew it existed. Inside were papers Charles had left me. Contracts, partnership agreements, documents no one else had touched. And the will. The real will. I had kept it hidden for months, too weak in grief to face it. But now I understood. Those documents weren't just paper. They were my voice, my proof, my weapon. The world thought I was silent. But silence was never weakness. It was strategy, and when the time came, my silence would break like a storm. For now, I played my role. The obedient, invisible helper. The aging woman too soft to fight back. I folded laundry while they plotted. I scrubbed pans while they laughed. I rocked Chloe to sleep while Sabrina whispered to her friends that I was nothing. But inside, something had shifted. I no longer felt erased. I felt hidden. And there is a great difference between being erased and being hidden. One is defeat. The other is preparation. I remembered something else Charles once told me long ago, after a particularly brutal storm had nearly sunk one of our shipments. You don't fight the storm when it's strongest, he said. You wait. You let it rage. And when it spends itself, you strike. That's what I would do. Sabrina thought she had buried me. Matthew thought I was nothing but a burden. Even little Chloe repeated their words, not knowing better, but I wasn't gone. I was waiting. And when I finally struck, they would understand the weight of everything they had erased. That night, I rose quietly, opened my closet, and placed my hand on the safe. I didn't open it. Not yet, but I whispered to it, to the papers inside, to the proof that I still mattered. They don't know me, not yet. But they will. And with that vow, I lay back down in my bed, no longer feeling quite so invisible, because I knew something no one else in that house knew. The story was not finished. Not theirs. Not mine, and certainly not Charles's. They thought I was powerless. They forgot I still held the keys to the kingdom. For months I had endured their whispers, their dismissals, their laughter at my expense. But now, in the stillness of my guest room, I finally turned to the one thing I had avoided since Charles's death. The safe. It sat in the back of my closet, hidden beneath an old quilt, silent but alive with secrets. My hands trembled as I pulled it out, the metal cold against my skin. I entered the code with muscle memory. Charles had taught it to me years ago. The lock clicked. Open inside lay the pieces of myself they had tried to erase. The true will, the partnership agreements with my name, signed boldly beside his, and a sealed envelope addressed to me in Charles's steady handwriting. I lifted it slowly, my heart pounding. The letter was short, but it was enough. Eleanor, if you're reading this, then I am gone. And I know how they will treat you. Do not let them. You are the heart of this company, and everything we built belongs to you. Protect it. Protect yourself. And remember, never show your full hand until you must. Always, Charles. Tears blurred the words, but my chest felt stronger than it had in months. Charles had known. He had seen it coming, and he had trusted me to carry the truth when everyone else tried to bury it. I wiped my eyes, slid the papers back into their folders, and knew exactly what I had to do. The next morning, I made my way quietly downtown to the law offices on Bay Street, where Jonathan Pierce still practiced. Jonathan had been Charles's attorney for decades, a sharp man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. When he saw me step into his office, he stood immediately. "Eleanor," he said, his voice softer than I expected. "I was wondering when you'd come." I placed the will and documents on his desk without a word. He read them carefully, his brow furrowing, his lips tightening. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me. "You know what this means, don't you?" he asked. I nodded. "It means they don't own what they think they own." A slow smile spread across his face. "Correct. According to this, Charles left everything, every asset, every property, every share of the company, to you. You are the sole executor of the Whitmore estate. Not Matthew. Not Sabrina." The words settled in my chest like fire catching on dry wood. I wasn't erased. I wasn't powerless. I was the one holding everything. For the first time in months, I walked back into the riverfront estate with my spine straight, my head lifted. I didn't show it outwardly, not yet. But inside, I was no longer a ghost. I was the storm they hadn't seen coming. That night, I overheard them. Sabrina's voice carried from the study, sharp and excited. If we sell the Riverbend dockyards, we'll have the cash ready for my brother's startup. He just needs one big investor to keep it alive. This is perfect timing, Matthew's voice followed, uncertain. But Riverbend's valuable. Dad always said, Dad's gone, Sabrina snapped. And Mom's too. Lost to understand. Trust me, Matthew. This will secure our future. I froze in the hallway, my blood running cold. The Riverbend dockyards. That land was one of Charles's greatest achievements, a cornerstone of the company. To sell it would be to carve out the heart of everything we had built. And worse, it would be gone forever. Wasted on Sabrina's brother's failing vanity project. I clenched my fists, not while I was alive. The next morning, I returned to Jonathan's office. I want the Riverbend property frozen, I told him firmly. No sale, no transfer. Nothing moves without my approval. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. It will be done. Legally, you have every right. And just like that, the first strike in my quiet war was delivered. When the deal collapsed a week later, the house was filled with chaos. I heard Matthew pacing the den, his voice rising. The buyer pulled out. He said the property was locked, something about legal restrictions. Do you know anything about this? Sabrina's voice cracked with fury. What? That's impossible. Unless there was silence. Heavy, angry silence. Then I heard her hiss, It's her. It has to be her. I sat in my small room upstairs, folding Chloe's dresses, a calm smile tugging at my lips. They had underestimated me, and now they knew it. From that moment on, the atmosphere in the house shifted. They no longer looked through me. They watched me. Their eyes narrowed when I entered a room, their conversations hushed when I passed by. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I simply carried on quietly, patiently, knowing the next move was mine. For the first time in months, I felt alive again, not erased, not invisible, but dangerous. Because I knew something Sabrina and Matthew didn't want to admit. The war had already begun, and I had no intention of losing. When truth finally speaks, lies have nowhere left to hide. The tension had been building for weeks. The Riverbend dockyard sale collapsed. Sabrina's plans unraveled, and whispers filled the estate like smoke before a fire. And then, Jonathan Pierce called for a family meeting. We gathered in the estate's grand dining room, the same place where I had once been humiliated, ignored, erased. But this time, I didn't sit in silence at the far end. I sat at the head of the table. Jonathan placed a thick folder in front of him, his silver hair gleaming in the afternoon light. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began. As Charles Whitmore's attorney for over 3 decades, I am here today to clarify the matter of his estate and legacy. Matthew leaned forward, his face pale but defiant. Sabrina sat rigid beside him, her lips pressed thin, her eyes glittering with anger. Jonathan's voice was steady, unshakable. According to Charles Whitmore's final, legal will, executed and notarized, the sole executor and inheritor of his estate, including all properties, assets, and company shares, is Eleanor Whitmore. The silence that followed was absolute. Matthew's jaw dropped, his breath caught. Sabrina's nails dug into the armrest of her chair, her face draining of color before flushing crimson. Jonathan continued calmly. This includes full authority over the Whitmore Shipping Company, its dockyards, and its investments. Any attempt to sell, transfer, or tamper with these assets without Eleanor's approval is not only invalid, but unlawful. The words hit the room like thunder. Sabrina turned to me, her voice a hiss. You planned this. You've been hiding it. I met her eyes for the first time in months, my voice quiet but steady. No, I was protecting it. Protecting Charles. Protecting myself. Something you never thought I had the strength to do. Fear flickered in her eyes before she masked it with rage, but the truth had already landed. The power had shifted. The days that followed were thick with silence. Sabrina no longer smirked in hallways. Matthew no longer dared to call me a burden. But the final reckoning came at the second service, a memorial gathering at the church where the will was read publicly. The cathedral was full. Friends, colleagues, extended family, business partners, church members, all the people who had watched me fade into the background now sat waiting. Jonathan stood at the lectern, the will in his hands. His voice carried clearly through the vaulted space. In accordance with the final wishes of Charles Whitmore, I hereby declare that his estate, business holdings, and assets shall be left in their entirety to his wife. Eleanor Whitmore, gasps echoed through the pews. Heads turned. Whispers rose and then silence. I stood. My knees trembled for a moment, but I steadied myself. The silence stretched as I looked at the faces before me. The very community that had pitied me, dismissed me, whispered about me. I took a breath. You all thought you knew the story, I began. My voice was low, but it carried. You thought Charles built this empire alone. You thought I was just a wife, a hostess, a shadow. Eyes locked on me. No one moved, but you were wrong. I was there in the beginning. I was there when we had nothing but a broken desk and a dream. I sold my mother's sapphire locket so we could pay our workers. I stayed up through the nights when there was no guarantee of morning. And I kept every promise Charles and I made to each other. My voice grew sharper. You let others erase me. You believed their lies. You made me invisible. But invisibility is not the same as absence. I was here. I have always been here. I turned then, letting my eyes fall on Sabrina and Matthew. Their faces were pale, exposed in front of everyone they had once manipulated. And let me say this clearly for everyone to hear. Respect is not given by inheritance. Respect is earned by truth. And the truth is that I built this with Charles. I will protect it. And I will not be erased again. For a moment, the cathedral was silent. Then a ripple of murmurs spread. Some nodded. Some looked ashamed, but Sabrina and Matthew sat frozen, powerless, their schemes unraveling before the very eyes of the community they had tried to fool. In the weeks that followed, I moved swiftly. I sold the Riverbend dockyards, not for Sabrina's brother, not for vanity, but to create something lasting. The proceeds funded the Charles Whitmore Foundation, a scholarship for young women in Savannah who, like me once, had been overlooked, dismissed, underestimated. Respect, I told Jonathan when the foundation launched, shouldn't die with memory. It should grow, he smiled, signing the final papers. Charles would be proud. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it too. I left the riverfront estate soon after. That house had become nothing but a prison, a monument to humiliation. Instead, I found a small carriage house near Savannah's historic district, with ivy climbing the walls and sunlight spilling through wide windows. It wasn't grand. It wasn't sprawling, but it was mine. The air there felt lighter, cleaner, free. I filled it with books, with photographs of Charles, with fresh flowers from the market. And every morning, I woke not to the weight of invisibility, but to the quiet dignity of my own space. One evening, I sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the church spires, listening to the faint hum of the city. For the first time in years, I felt peace because I had won, not just the estate, not just the company, not just the war against Sabrina and Matthew. I had won myself back. I whispered into the soft night air, as if Charles could hear me still. Respect is the real inheritance. And for the first time since his death, I felt him near, not in the weight of grief, but in the strength of survival. In the end, Eleanor didn't need revenge to win. She needed truth, the money, the company, the name. All of it meant nothing without respect. And that was the one thing she made sure no one could ever steal again. If you felt her story, don't forget, real strength isn't loud. It's lasting. Respect is the real inheritance. Subscribe for more stories that remind us, no matter how they try to bury you, you can always rise again.